This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Greylorn by Keith Laumer. Prologue. The murmur of conversation around the conference table died as the World Secretary entered the room and took his place at the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I'll not detain you with formalities today. The representative of the Navy Department is waiting outside to present his case for his proposal. You all know something of the scheme. It has been heard and passed as feasible by the advisory group. It will now be our responsibility to make the decision. I ask that each of you, in forming a conclusion, remember that our present situation can only be described as desperate, and that desperate measures may be in order." The Secretary turned and nodded to a braided admiral seated near the door, who left the room and returned a moment later with a young, gray-haired naval officer. "Members of the Council," said the admiral, "this is Lieutenant Commander Greylorn." All eyes followed the officer as he walked the length of the room to take the empty seat at the end of the table. "Please proceed, Commander," said the Secretary. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary." The commander's voice was unhurried and low, yet it carried clearly and held authority. He began without preliminary. "When the world government dispatched the scouting forces 43 years ago, an effort was made to contact each of the 25 worlds to which this government had sent colonization parties during the colonial era of the mid-20th centuries. With the return of the last of the scouts early this year, we were forced to realize that no assistance would be forthcoming from that source." The commander turned his eyes to the world map covering the wall. With the exception of North America and a narrow strip of coastal waters, the entire map was tinted an unhealthy pink. "The latest figures compiled by the Department of the Navy indicate that we are losing area at the rate of 1 square mile every 21 hours. The organism's faculty for developing resistance to our chemical and biological measures appears to be evolving rapidly. Analyses of atmospheric samples indicate the level of noxious content rising at a steady rate. In other words, in spite of our best efforts, we are not holding our own against the red tide." A mutter ran around the table as members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "A great deal of thought has been applied to the problem of increasing our offensive ability. This in the end is still a question of manpower and raw resources. We do not have enough. Our small improvements in effectiveness have been progressively offset by increasing casualties and loss of territory. In the end, alone, we must lose." The commander paused as the murmur rose and died again. "There is, however, one possibility still unexplored," he said, "and recent work done at the Polar Research Station places the possibility well within the scope of feasibility. At the time the attempt was made to establish contact with the colonies, one was omitted. It alone now remains to be sought out. I refer to the Omega colony." A portly member leaned forward and burst out, "The location of the colony is unknown." The Secretary intervened. "Please permit the commander to complete his remarks. There will be ample opportunity for discussion when he has finished." "This contact was not attempted for 2 reasons," the commander continued. "First, the precise location was not known. Second, the distance was at least twice that of the earlier colonies. At the time, there was a feeling of optimism which seemed to make the attempt superfluous. Now, the situation has changed. The possibility of contacting Omega Colony now assumes paramount importance. The development of which I spoke is a new application of drive principle which has given to us a greatly improved effective velocity for space propulsion. 40 years ago the minimum elapsed time of return travel to the presumed sector within which the Omega world would lie was about a century. Today we have the techniques to construct a small scouting vessel, capable of making the transit in just over 5 years. We cannot hold out here for a century, perhaps, but we can manage a decade. As for location, we know the initial target point toward which Omega was launched. The plan was, of course, that a precise target should be selected by the crew after approaching the star group closely enough to permit telescopic planetary resolution and study. There is no reason why the crew of a scout could not make the same study and examination of possible targets, and with luck find the colony. Omega was the last colonial venture undertaken by our people, 2 centuries after the others. It was the best equipped and largest expedition of them all. It was not limited to one destination, little known, but had a presumably large selection of potentials from which to choose. And her planetary study facilities were extremely advanced. I have full confidence that Omega made a successful planetfall, and has by now established a vigorous new society. Honorable members of the Council, I submit that all the resources of this government should be at once placed at the disposal of a task force with the assigned duty of constructing a 50,000-ton scouting vessel, and conducting an exhaustive survey of a volume of space of 1,000 AUs centered on the so-called Omega Cluster. The World Secretary interrupted the babble which arose with the completion of the officer's presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, time is of the essence of our problem. Let's proceed at once to orderly interrogation. Mr. Clayle, lead off, please. The portly councillor glared at the commander. The undertaking you propose, sir, will require a massive diversion of our capacities from defense. That means losing ground at an increasing rate to the obscenity crawling over our planet. That same potential applied to direct offensive measures may yet turn the balance in our favor. Against this, the possibility of a scouting party stumbling over the remains of a colony, the location of which is almost completely problematical, and which by analogy with all the earlier colonial attempts has at best managed to survive as a marginal foothold, is so fantastically remote as to be inconsiderable. The commander listened coolly, seriously. Mr. Councillor, he replied, as to our defensive measures, we have passed the point of diminishing returns. We have more knowledge now than we are capable of employing against the plague. Had we not neglected the physical sciences as we have for the last 2 centuries, we might have developed adequate measures before we had been so far reduced in numbers and area as to be unable to produce and employ the new weapons our laboratories have belatedly developed. Now we must be realistic. There is no hope in that direction. As to the location of the Omega world, our plan is based on the fact that the selection was not made at random. Our scout will proceed along the Omega course line as known to us from the observations which were carried on for almost 3 years after its departure. We propose to continue on that line, carrying out systematic observation of each potential sun in turn. As we detect planets, we will alter course only as necessary to satisfy ourselves as to the possibility of suitability of the planet. We can safely assume that Omega will not have bypassed any likely target. If we should have more than one prospect under consideration at any time, we shall examine them in turn. If the Omega world has developed successfully, ample evidence should be discernible at a distance. Clayle muttered, "Madness," and subsided. The angular member on his left spoke gently. "Mr. Greylorn, why, if this colonial venture has met with the success you assume,
Has its government not re-established contact with the mother world during the